Hi, everybody. I'm Marilyn. I'm the CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs and the host of our weekly live video series called Centaur Stage. We're in the middle of our second season, all about the magic of teams and what makes teams cohesive, high-performing, and happy. And today I'm doing something I've never done before. It's a special episode that we're doing as a conclusion to our first chapter of the season, which was all about team dynamics. And in this episode, I'm running solo, meaning I don't have any guests today, but what I will try to do is in the next 20, 30, 40 minutes or until I faint, I'm going to take some time to share some of my own insights and reflections about team dynamics and what makes great teams. I'll also be sharing some key learnings from all of the previous speakers that came and joined us on this first chapter. Try to summarize everything we've learned before we move on to our next chapter. Chapter 2 is all about building teams, and I'll let you know at the end of this episode who the guest is and what we'll be talking about. As you will recall, Centaur Stage goes live every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. UAE time, and so do join us for our upcoming episodes. And before we begin, I'm really all alone here, so I'll be looking at the comments to get some support from you guys and hopefully reactions. You can, of course, ask me questions. I'd love to, know what you guys are thinking or how you, approach these topics in your own organizations. So please do make the comment section go alive because otherwise I'm going to feel really alone up here. Now, so let me kind of take you through what I've worked on. As I was preparing for this episode with my team, I really wanted to create like a meaningful recap for us to have a foundation to go from. Teams are this kind of mythical creature. We don't always understand them really well, and we don't always have the same agreement on what the definition of a team is. One thing we know for sure is that not every group of people who are working together is a team. Right. And that's why when we started this first chapter and we hosted Connie Hadley, who's an organizational psychologist and a friend of mine, we wanted to explore, to start with a definition of what teams are. Some of the things she taught us, I'm going to try and recap for you here. So in her words, she said, a team is the sense of synergy that you get when you combine different outputs. And I really love that sentence. And if you take time to kind of break it apart, you'll understand why. And I'll come back to it in a minute. And Connie, of course, referred to Richard Hackman's model for defining a team. So according to him, teams have a few set of criteria, right? Groups of people working together can be called a team if they have, one, a clear and motivating direction, sharing a goal or an objective, knowing where they're headed together. Two, a sense of boundedness, and that means knowing who is on the team and who isn't. In many of our interventions with clients, when we ask people, what team are you on? They don't always have the same answer. They don't always call their team the same thing. And sometimes people just don't actually know what team they're on. And so that sense of boundedness is so important. Another one of his criteria, number 3, is having a sense of stable membership. That means that when you're a member of a team, you don't keep being moved around. And of course, in today's organizations, that's not as obvious as it sounds. Companies are constantly reorganizing, task forces are coming up, group projects, and so on. And so it's often the case that people are members of many teams and don't have a sense of that core team that they contribute to. Number 4 is clearly defined roles. And that's another one that again and again, we see in our work with our clients that it's not always clear what everybody does. Sometimes people overlap, that frustrates everyone, and also doesn't take advantage of everybody's ability to contribute. And then number 5 is a sense of integration. Now, of course, having all of the characteristics of those teams put together isn't enough, right? I think that the big question around the difference between group work and teamwork requires something more than just the definition of what a team structure looks like, right? Because I think that then that's what Connie was saying. She was saying sense of synergy that you get when you combine different outputs. And I think that definition is really valuable because it's more than just putting people together in a group and saying, here you go, you're a team, right? I think some of the elements that really make a group of people come together as a team is this idea of interdependence. Joe Santos, a professor of mine at INSEAD and someone I've been thinking about these topics with since practically the beginning of the pandemic, defines teams as being, on the one hand, a small group of individuals acting together, but on the other, that they have interdependent performance and shared accountability. And that interdependent performance piece is really, really important because it says that it's not about people coming together and each of them producing a piece of the puzzle. Actually, Joe has a really nice metaphor for teamwork and puzzles. Essentially, the way he looks at it is, let's say that we gave different pieces of puzzle to the different team members. In group work, everybody just has one piece. They have to figure out where to put it. And once they put it in the right place, their work is done. But in teamwork, the metaphor that he uses is that every time one of the team members puts down their piece of the puzzle, the shape and color and size of the pieces that the other people are holding change. And that interdependence, the idea that my contribution is made different by the contribution of others, that we create synergy, is such an essential part of teamwork. And Joe and I actually wrote an article originally for me and my team to keep as an internal document that we could think through, but we've published it recently on our website, so we'll link that in the comments in a minute. But we wrote an article to also push the definition of team to also understanding what teamwork is, right? Because theoretically, you put people together in a team so that they can provide teamwork. And so something that we wrote is that a team is a structure. So it's a group of people structured in a certain way, but teamwork is a process. So it's equally important that we think about the process in which people co-create, in which they create in an interdependent mode. So teamwork in that sense is not just the output of a group of people that we call a team, it's the process by which this output is created. Another metaphor that Tala brought into our vocabulary, because she's always been the athletic one in the company, is that we can compare group work to an Olympics gymnastics team, right? So that's a team where each athlete is scored for their distinct competitions and their individual scores are put together to produce the final score. But teamwork is more like maybe a football or a basketball team. And that's because everybody plays in sync and what someone does influences what the other person does, going towards achieving that common goal. And I also wrote in that article that a really beautiful quirk of the English language is that group work is 2 words, whereas teamwork is a single word. And I think that act of melding words together is so symbolic of how teamwork is constructed. So that's it on what makes teams. We also wanted to reflect on whether or not teams need leaders. But I see that there are a few questions in the audience. So maybe I'll start with those and then come back to my second chapter of my intervention here today. So Karma asks, can teams form without a conscious decision to start one? If people simply find themselves working towards the same goal, for example, with combined efforts? That's a really good question, actually. I'm sure that there have been more than one team in history that just started off without saying, hey, let's create a team. But I think that very quickly you end up needing to be intentional about the fact that this is a team, clarifying who the members are, how you're going to make decisions together, making sure actually that you are actually, working towards the same goal. It's easy to assume that you are. So yes, I do think that sometimes teams come together from like sheer connection to a purpose, but I don't think they can stay together for very long if they don't clarify that team structure, the way they want to work together and their process. And, that idea of that stable membership is so important. And so you might come together coincidentally, but I don't think you stay together coincidentally. Billy asks, what's the best way to create synergy when your teammates work remotely? And Billy, I'll tell you, we have a whole section planned on this, so I'll come back to you in a second. Now, the next question that I asked our guest as we were exploring the definition of what a team is I wondered whether teams need leaders. Do we need a team leader for a team to be called a team, right? The reason why I asked that question is, of course, we're quite used to finding in most, typical organizations, we always have hierarchy. So you will always have somebody who's the manager or the leader, and then a team reporting into them. And hierarchy is great. I mean, it's neither good or bad. It's useful. It creates structure. It creates coordination. It creates paths for information to be shared. And good leaders, they know how to use hierarchy to get things done. But there are other types of organizations and other types of teams. And here I'm thinking more about Scrum or Agile teams, where they're actually, if you ask purists in that field, there's actually no prescription for there to be a leader. In fact, if anything, those teams want more independence and more decision-making within the team, and they actually flatten the hierarchy in that sense. And you can find that also in holacracy and other kinds of more flattened organizations that don't believe in hierarchy. And so I wanted to ask our guests, and think about it myself, whether teams do need a leader, right? When we talk about that shared goal, do we need someone who is accountable for that shared goal? Again, in teams like Agile or Scrum teams, those roles disappear. Instead, there are new roles that emerge that take some part of a leader's role. For example, Scrum Masters, they take care of getting burdens out of the way and making sure that everybody's aligned. Or Agile coaches will take care of making sure that everybody has the right mindset and engagement and is following the right process. And in that sense, those teams can survive quite well without a determined leader. But I think all teams need a sense of leadership, right? And I think that was something that was echoed by a few of our guests here. Connie mentioned that it's not necessary for every team to have a leader, but as long as the team members have a sense of leadership, as long as they're aiming towards the same goal and they feel accountable and responsible for it. Munir, who was our latest guest last week, he told us about how he works towards making sure that every person on his team is a leader. Everyone is taking ownership of their space and able to make decisions. I really don't think that a determined leader is always necessary, but I think that as teams grapple with more complex tasks or bigger tasks, they might need one. I fully understand how a software team might not need a leader. In the end, the way that the output of a software team is measured is whether their increment, the product that they're working on, its addition to the existing software creates an improved performance, and the way that their work is validated is, does it integrate into the code, and can we do regression testing? There's a lot of automation in validating the contribution of a software team. But I think that in other industries and other contexts, you do need a leader sometimes to just move things forward. And I think one of my favorite definitions of leadership, again, coming here from Joe Santos's class, one that I remember from 2017, and it really meant a lot to me, and funnily enough was echoed by Sam and Sylvia, is that the role of a leader, the role of a manager, is to protect the team from the uncertainty of the world so that they can do their best work, right? Sam, who was our second guest and who's the CEO of Teamform, he defines good team leaders as people who help their teams perform well by focusing on pushing away external blockers and making the space for them to be creative and innovate, right? So it's about that leader kind of creating that space for everybody on the team to do their best work. Sylvia Burberry, who's the regional director of Emerging and Seeds at Royal Canin and who was our third guest, her notion of leadership is also similar to those lines. She spoke about how her personal goal as a leader is to create the conditions for people to succeed. And I think she put it very beautifully. She said, that means that most of the time her job is importing stress and exporting calm. And I really think that echoes with the definition that I love. I think especially in the last few years, we've all been through, the pandemic together, moments of incredible uncertainty, and had to navigate teams through that. And I think leaders who were able to somehow create a sense of calm and a sense of limited certainty, because of course they could never provide full certainty, were able to help their teams through that moment. And then, if you watched any of our episodes, you know that we also asked at the end of each of them a series of rapid fire questions. And one of them was, what makes a great team leader? I'm going to read here some of the answers that we got. So for Connie, a good team leader is someone who's not constantly trying to impress, someone who can take criticism and wants the best for others, and who does everything they can to help the rest of the group be successful. To Sam, it's someone who unblocks things. To Sylvia, it's someone who's empathic, open, creates space for team members to be heard. And to Munir, it's a listener. And then, of course, we can go back to academia, which is something we love to do here at Cosmic Centaurs, to see once more what Richard Hackman, who's one of the leading academics on the topic of teams, had to say about what makes for a great team leader. And so Hackman here mentions 4 personal qualities that distinguish really great team leaders from others. Number 1 is the team leader is aware of the components that form team effectiveness. Number 2 is they have the ability to narrow the gap between present capability of their teams and where they could and should be, meaning they're able to build on top of those capabilities and kind of understand what will the team should be able to do in order to get the job done, and how can I make sure that they acquire those skills. And I see that Benny has asked a question here about acquiring skills without going for a course, and I'll come back to it in a second. And the third criteria is that they have to have the emotional maturity to lead. And that's that they're able to cope with anxiety, provoking situations. They're able to manage their emotions, and they're able to take those instances as learning opportunities. And the last one is really a personal favorite, which is that they have to have personal courage and have the ability to challenge group norms. And I think that, we would not disagree with any of the things that Richard Hackman says. And I think, again, it comes back to that point about how you are able to manage complexity and uncertainty and ambiguity, and how you're able to lead your team through those moments. I think that's what makes a great team leader. I'll take a few questions from the audience before kind of wrapping it up on this question of team leaders. So Benny, you asked if, how team members can learn more skills without going for a course. I think I've always been self-taught for most things that I've learned in life, except for when I went to do my executive MBA, mostly because I couldn't remember what EBIT meant every day of the week until I took a real course. But I think that the beauty is the internet is an abundant place. The community of the web is quite generous in sharing their lessons learned and important highlights and insights about any topic. And so I've learned most of what I know from Googling it, to be honest. And I think if you're curious and you understand that for most problems, not all of them, unless you're truly creating something that's never been innovated on before, a lot of the problems you face on a day-to-day basis, a lot of the skills you want to acquire, they've been spoken about. And so if you have the patience and the courage to be curious and to learn in and of yourself, and then to start trying to apply these new skills that you find as you go, I think that goes a long way. And so to wrap this up, I think I also want to talk about one vision of the leader that I really love, and I always cite it in the workshops that we do, especially when I'm talking to executives, that really feel the pressure of that anxiety. And this comes from Andy Grove's High Output Management. And he says something really interesting about how leaders should lead. He says that when complexity and uncertainty and ambiguity, this is kind of the antecedent to VUCA, now we call it the VUCA world. But when all of those things are low, meaning there's some certain level of predictability in your industry or in your market, then a team's performance should be influenced by expectation setting. And that means being super clear on the objectives, the goals, the KPIs, the timelines, and sticking to them. But when complexity and uncertainty and ambiguity are high, then he says that the way that managers should lead and create performance for their teams is that they should lead through their cultural values. And I think the pandemic has really brought that home for us, because at the time where no one could predict where their market or industry was going to go, the only thing we really had was our values, and that's what we came back to. That's what we came home to, and that's how we led. Tala asks me what I have learned from some of the teams that I've built or led or participated in, and I'll try to answer her by the end of this. And then Rhea's asking, how can team members also show up for leaders? It's a two-way relationship, and doesn't the leader need some protection as well? And for those of you who know me, that's a question that's very close to my heart. I've always felt like there was this kind of duality or opposition between people and their team leaders or their managers. I think this comes from our systems of management that make the manager responsible for reviewing performance, but not always responsible for creating the right conditions for performance and taking ownership of those conditions. And in that sense, the manager or the leader takes on this role of judge and separates from their team. And as a leader who myself is very invested in the success of my team, I also often find it hard when I'm left out of the team, whether it would have been for a social event, or recently we started using this software that measures engagement, and I don't get asked any questions because I'm the leader. Only my team does. And I really don't think that that's healthy relationship. I don't like it that way, because I'm equally part of the team as everybody else. And in the same way that I have power to improve things, I do believe that everybody on the team does too. And I think that the way that team members can show up for their leaders is to remember to ask the human questions. Leaders aren't super people. They just try really hard to create great environments for others. And they have lonely days, they have bad days, they have shameful and angry days. And sometimes all it takes is just to ask them, like, how are you doing today? And to mean it and to want to listen to their answer. Leaders need that support too. And it can get very lonely sometimes. So thank you for asking that question. And so that kind of wraps it up in terms of what is a team and does it need a leader? I think the next piece is really around, if we understand now that a team exists and is an entity, like I always like to think of teams as an organic living being, right? That has its own rules and its own nature. Then it's so important to understand how we make them thrive. It's almost like having a plant. You need to know how much sunlight and water and what conditions it needs to be in order to thrive. And it is really an ecosystem in that sense. And so we're going to talk about what we've learned in terms of what can make teams really thrive and overperform. And on the one hand, we're going to talk about, let's say the first half of Andy Grove's recommendation, which is around that shared goals, the expectation setting, and then giving them the right resources to be able to thrive. And then on the other hand, we'll talk about something that's really close to my heart and has been proven, by the way, to be equally important as expectation setting, which is the engagement piece, which is how do you create high levels of mutual knowledge and high levels of connectedness in teams, because we know that has just as much impact on performance as hardcore KPIs. So let's start with the KPI side. Teams, of course, need the right context. They need the right environment. They need the resources to be able to collaborate and create value. They really should be treated as entities in and of themselves. And an observation that we had when Sam was our guest is that so many of our corporate leaders today, they're hardwired to think about their organization in terms of hierarchy, in terms of who reports to whom and how are people grouped. But they don't actually really have a sense of the teams within their company, even though teams are most likely to be the ones delivering real value. I remember there was an interview of Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, and he was saying that most innovations that came out of Google started in a team of 3 or 5 people. And yet so many organizations don't have the tools or even the understanding to think about their teams in that sense, right? And so, of course, it's necessary to understand these things in order to help this group of people create something that's larger than the sum of their parts, that true magic of teams, the true synergy. And processes and systems are important. And then Sam kind of, the founder of T-Form got us some perspective also on how important it is to be able to measure the health of teams and to be able to make data-driven, informed decisions about how teams are performing and how they can be helped. We talked, of course, about the importance of sharing goals. We talked also about the importance of having access to resources that allow teams to be autonomous. Sam really emphasized how high-performing teams are ones that don't have to rely on other teams in order to get the job done. We all know the cost of coordination and how much we have to spend on just the inner politics of organizations when our team isn't able to deliver what they need to deliver without having to, onboard 5 other teams, right? And that's why it's so important to think about building teams that are cross-functional, building teams that are diverse, that are given clear goals and resources, outside of just thinking about who reports to whom. And Sam here talked to us about how data can be a great tool for measuring that efficiency and productivity and engagement within teams. And again, the fact here is that most companies will measure this at an organizational or an individual level, but we really need to think about how to measure these things at a team level. And so one of the tools that was recommended by Sam that's quite useful is the Atlasian project Team Health Check. We'll put a link for that in the comments as well. And it helps to identify the weaknesses and strengths of teams. And here's what it measures for. One is, funnily enough, it measures for having a full-time owner. So that's a leader who more than 80% of their time is dedicated to a project. It looks at having a balanced team in terms of the diversity of the resources and capabilities, a shared understanding of why everybody is here. Do we have a shared purpose, a clear goal that we're working towards? And do we know the value that we're trying to create and how we measure it, what our metrics are, what our KPIs are? Do we have a problem that we're trying to solve that is super clear to us? Have we summarized this in a one-pager? And then are we good at managing the dependencies that we have as a team and the speed at which we operate? And this is a health check that you can run with your team. Team members either give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a sideways thumbs. And that's kind of how you can get a sense of, is this team really being given what it needs in order to do its best work, right? And that's the performance side of things. And I recently contributed to an article that we published here on Cosmic Centaur's website about performance reviews, right? We're talking about the hard side of management, the objectives, the goals, the desired outcome. And there's a really great Gallup survey where they surveyed 8,000 employees and actually found that the highest performing managers, and therefore the highest performing teams, are managers that manage both the performance and the engagement, right? They're not just focused on KPIs, they're also focused on energizing, motivating, connecting their team members. And in that case, they found that when a manager does both, employees are 17 times more likely to be engaged. And we know that engaged employees are more likely to perform. And I'll give you more data about that in a second. And that brings us to kind of our second piece, which is, yes, it's important that we all know what we're working towards, but it's equally important that we're able to build connection and community with each other. And this piece on having high levels of mutual knowledge, high levels of connectedness, and high levels of psychological safety, which is a word that has come up a lot, and we'll discuss it here, really matters. We know that having happy and cohesive teams really does matter and really has an impact on your top and bottom lines. Let's talk about psychological safety first. That's a term that was coined and popularized by Amy Edmondson. She actually ran a research project for Google where they were trying to figure out how they could create the best performing teams. What were those ingredients? What was happening in teams that were high performing inside Google? We have a tendency to think that if you put the A players all together, that you'll have an A team. But actually that wasn't the case at all. And so Project Aristotle, wanted to identify and uncover what criteria make really high performing teams. And it found many different points of influence, but the one single highest determining piece was this question of psychological safety, right? And psychological safety in teams means that the team and its leader have been able to create a space where people are comfortable admitting mistakes, where they can learn from failure, where everybody openly shares ideas, and that leads to more innovation and better decision making. And the thinking here is that if you provide the basic hygiene for a team, right? Clear structure, access to resources, a great team leader, the next step in having a team that overperforms over all the others is creating that space, is creating the safety, which leads to having a team that has more of a learning behavior, a team that's more open to failure, more open to innovation, more freely shares those ideas. And that's what leads to team performance. So that's kind of the link between psychological safety and team performance as an outcome. And Connie, who's researched and published quite, a bit on the topic, she talked about psychological safety as something that needs to be intentional and established as an explicit norm for team members. To know that they can speak up, to know that they can share their thoughts and ideas. And it's a norm that it's better to establish it as early as possible from the very beginning of a team. It's hard to walk back from a space where people don't feel safe. There's going to be 4 times more work to be done there. Also, it is possible. And that's why psychological safety is such an important piece. And the way that you can create psychological safety outside of, leadership behavior and creating those spaces and a few rituals like retrospectives and so on, which we can talk about. There is a thought around level of interpersonal knowledge. So that's how much do we know about each other's stories and how much do we connect with one another. And that's why the concept of mutual knowledge is so important. Last year, I wrote an article in WAMDA about this. I believe it was maybe in August, not so long ago. And the idea behind mutual knowledge is that it's knowledge about each other that is shared and it's known to be shared. And it's really a vital factor in facilitating effective team interactions and team performance. And I think that's especially true in remote or hybrid environments. And we know for a fact that the greater mutual knowledge within a team, the more team members have context for interpreting others' actions and words, and the better the performance and the quality of the decision making. Sylvia, of course, who manages a team across 14 different time zones, highlighted the importance of taking that moment to break down those personal barriers. She talked about how important it is to be intentional, to make the time for these interactions. She mentioned how she takes time to make sure she does check-ins, not just at a team level, but also at an individual one. She talked about creating the right moments to learn more about one another and build trust together, how she creates space for her team members to disagree with her, even sometimes prompting people who she knows feel a little bit more safe around her to disagree publicly, just to show to everybody else that she's not going to react badly. Actually, we're all going to learn from it together. She also told us that despite being in 14 different time zones, her team always has asked actually to always make time to have some level of interpersonal meetings synchronously, although the default would be to say, oh, it's just too hard to be all awake at the same time. But they really value that connection, right? Karma is asking me here, do you think psychological safety can always be created no matter the circumstances and personal traits of the team leader and team member? That's a really tough one. I think, Karma, it takes a certain kind of leader for sure to care about psychological safety of others. I think you have to be pretty confident, perhaps. That's a conversation I've been having with Connie about that, where you don't feel the need to manage through fear or through shame, but rather manage through creating space for everybody and letting them flourish and be the best version of themselves. I think everybody's willing to give each other a chance. So of course it's easier with team members who themselves already feel pretty confident and pretty safe. It's harder when there are previous experiences that make you lack trust, that don't allow you to open up and be vulnerable or even be courageous about your ideas. But I do think that if there is the intention to do that, every team can reach levels of psychological safety that allows that space for them, right? Marie's asking if I think that teams in different fields require the same components to have great team dynamics. Theoretically, yes. I mean, every team I've worked in, and I've been in a bunch of industries, right, from consulting to technology to real estate, I've always found the same ingredients work. And that's probably because human nature matters more than industry. And so I really do think that it's all the same. Yeah, Nihal is asking us about the great resignation here. So she's saying companies everywhere are seeing big employee turnover. How do teams impact employee turnover, and how can we keep teams motivated even as team members change? That's a really hard one. And again, I go back to the same tenets, right? If you focus on the personal goals of every person and their personal values, how they align with the companies, if you are intentful about engaging people, even in hard times, if you're willing to be vulnerable. And also, I think a big piece of the great resignation is if you're able to listen to the fact that people do not want to work in the same ways anymore. They do not want to spend the same amount of time at the office. They want more balance in their lives. Like, that's what we're hearing over and over again. And I think, again, that intent, and this doesn't just come from the leaders of teams, but I think the leaders of organizations, to say, I am listening to the fact that people want things differently, and I'm going to try and do what I can, what is economically viable for the organization, but also what matters to my teams and my employees, to create the right conditions for them. Then I don't see why people would leave, unless they've suddenly realized that, this really wasn't their career path and they want to go do something completely different, in which case you should just be happy for them that they found their calling. I think a lot of the great resignation comes from this tension between how people think about what they want work to provide for them and how they're actually being asked to do work. I think there was a data point that we cited recently that 90% of people expect to experience joy at work, yet only 37% of them say that they do. So that huge gap of 53% of people, there's a place to start. And recently, Slack also published a report that showed that 66% of managers were designing their post-pandemic work policies without input from their people. And so this isn't just a team problem. It's a question of whether companies are willing to listen to what their employees really want, And on that point, just going back to that question of connectedness, I think that when you feel connected and close to the people you work with, you're also less likely to leave, because you know that you're in a place where you're understood, where people don't misinterpret things, where they're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think that that's something really important. Connie talked to us about that. She spoke to us about how knowing about each other's context allows members to have conversations, to support each other during those difficult times, to celebrate wins when they come across, and to make sure that you don't let conflict spread out. And that's such an important point, and we spend a lot of time worrying about that here at Cosmic. It's also why we created our platform Aeon, where we share our moods, we answer questions about ourselves, we see the news in the local context of our team members, because that context is so important. And here I'm going to cite a study that I really don't intend for it to be sexist, but hear me out. There was a research conducted, I think, in the early 2010s around what makes high-performing teams. And this was really a reaction, actually, to 9/11, where the CIA wanted to understand why their teams of counterterrorism hadn't been good at essentially figuring out what was going to happen. And long story short, the outcome of this research showed that teams that had more women on them perform better. Now, I'm not saying that it's because women are smarter, although maybe we are, but that's not why. Actually, it turns out that the analysis of why that was consistently the case is that women are socialized to be more attentive to the needs and the preferences of others. That's not necessarily a good thing. It's just we're taught to always care for what others want. And so in teams that had more women, there was more space for every team member to be able to be valued for who they are and to be heard. And that created higher performing teams, right? And we know that women consistently score higher on social sensitivity tests, and that's kind of where that comes from, right? But that's just to say that it's so important to create space for every individual to feel engaged. When it comes to the data around engagement, we know the data, right? Engaged employees are 44% more productive than satisfied employees. Inspired employees are 125% more productive than satisfied employees. And if you want to understand what goes into the building blocks of engaged versus inspired, it's a great article that's published on HBR. I think Bain was also contributed to the research. We'll link it for you as well. What does that mean? That means that inspired employee, in order to replace them, you need 2.25 satisfied employees in terms of their productivity. And this stands true across industry, company size, nationality, good and bad economic conditions. We know that people who are engaged produce better results. And yet we constantly ignore what people need to feel engaged. And a big part of that is human connection. Of course, there's the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, which is they need structure, they need compensation, they need clear goals. I get that. But the people who really overperform on that pyramid have much more than that. And part of it is the connectedness. And on the other hand, we know what happens when we don't get that right. We get high levels of disengagement. And in the US, this is pre-pandemic numbers, but disengagement cost the economy $350 billion. Globally, 60% of disengaged employees cost their companies the equivalent of 18% of their annual salary. That means that if you're a 10,000 person company and the average salary is $50,000, then you're losing $60 million a year just by ignoring that engagement piece. And that's really the crux of it, I think, for me. I talked a lot about this with Munir, our last guest, about how we as leaders can create happiness at work and engagement at work. And I think it comes through repetitive intent and repetitive action and focusing on getting that message across that we care, that we want people to be engaged, that we want them to be fulfilled, to grow, to have opportunity. And I think something we've always spoken about here at Cosmic Centaurs and continue to speak about, and I'm always surprised by how few companies actually have developed these things with the kind of intent that they should, is this question of rituals. And so rituals are activities that teams engage in willingly, collectively, and to which they attribute meaning and purpose. And it sounds like such an easy thing that I'm always surprised by how few companies and organizations actually leverage them. I want to share maybe some of the rituals that we practice here at Cosmic Centaurs and try to explain how I think that they contribute to creating the right team dynamics. One ritual that we never skip is that we have a daily stand-up where we share what we're up to, our progress, what's getting in our way. It's a moment for us to also come together and stand in solidarity. If someone is unable to finish a task, if they need support, we're all there to jump in. We also make sure to check in during those stand-ups with one another. We use our platform Aeon to see how everybody's feeling, whether those are feelings that require support, like anger or frustration or being overwhelmed, or feelings that lead to celebration, like being excited about something or energized or grateful. That's something that we kind of take part in, and we take time to also understand the local context. Many of our team members live in Lebanon, which is also where I'm from, and that's an incredibly stressful place to live and work from. And so if your colleagues don't understand what's going on around you in your context, then they can't understand why you're behaving a certain way or reacting a certain way, or why you couldn't make it to the meeting or didn't turn on your camera that day. And I think being mindful of those circumstances is so important. Another favorite ritual of mine is retrospectives. And that's a moment where every cycle, and in our case, it's every month, we come together to talk about what we could have done better, what we did really well, what we can start doing to improve the collaboration between us. And again, that creates a space for everybody to bring up issues and problems and failures and learn from them together, and sends the signal that it's all right to fail as long as we learn from it, and creates the space for that kind of learning mentality to be established. Another favorite ritual, and this one really is not at all about performance, it's just about getting to know each other and spending some good time, is that once a month we also organize team time, which is time that we dedicate to just being together. And sometimes we play games. Sometimes we use our cosmic conversations, which are prompt cards with questions that you can ask your team members to answer and get to know about each other. So we just answer a few questions and find out new things about one another. We've recently done a escape the room virtually all together. Very happy to say that we won with flying colors. And I think, showing that we care about spending time with each other, even if we're not working, is so important, because it means that we care about each other as individuals and humans and not just about colleagues. There are so many other rituals that we take part in, but I think those are my favorites. And those are just some ways in which we can show up for each other and create that space. Benny was asking how leaders keep psychological safety within a team while making sure that team members understand they're accountable for their work. I often find that actually holding other people accountable for their work, if you do it in a way that's nurturing and it's about making sure that that other person achieves what they set out to achieve, I think is a great gift. I think leaders that shy away, leaders that just focus on the engagement piece and they want everybody to be happy and they never share difficult feedback or let somebody know that they're falling behind, I don't think those are leaders who really care. I think it's a lot easier to just be the happy, engaging one, but there are moments where that can't be the way in which you engage with your team members. You have to let them know as early as you can when they're failing in their accountability and their responsibility. And I think that's a true sign of love and care, having the courage to call somebody out instead of waiting for them to crash is such an important piece of it. And so thank you for asking that question, Benny. I really think, like I said earlier, that both accountability and engagement are important, and you can't do one without the other. And so with that, I think I've answered all of the questions that I've seen here in the feed. You guys have put in so many. I hope I didn't skip any. But I'm happy to keep answering them later. I'm also really grateful for the time you spent with me. I know it's been, 45 minutes or so, and I hope that this was really useful for you guys. For me, it's just really important. I've learned so much from our speakers over the last 4 weeks, and it was really important to recap it and put it in, in a format that we can come back to it. It's almost like a framework, what's a team? Do we need a leader? What makes a great leader? And then how do we treat teams as entities and give them what they need? Everything from clear expectation setting to fluffy moments where we care for one another. And all of these things have to happen at the same time. And so with that, if you've stuck around this long, I'm incredibly grateful for your time, and I hope that you've learned with me, and I'll go back and read all of the comments and learn from some of the ideas and thoughts that you've contributed. Before I go, just a few things here and there. First of all, please do follow us on all our socials or sign up to our newsletter. We're about to send one next week that has all of our content around how to wrap up the year, retrospectives, performance reviews, gift ideas, you name it, we got it. So do sign up to our newsletter on our website, and we'll also share the link in the comments. Next week is a day off here in the UAE, and we try to be very diligent about taking time off when we can. And so we won't be here, but we will start our second chapter all about building teams on December 9th on LinkedIn Live, 3:30 p.m. UAE time. That's 12:30 CET if you're joining from Europe. And my first guest on that second chapter of building teams is going to be Jonathan Yeo, and he's going to talk to us about diversity. And with that, I'm going to wrap up our show today. Thank you so much. And thank you for making the comments come to life. It definitely made me feel less lonely and less stressed out. I was quite anxious about it before we started it. So I'm really grateful for everybody who was here with me. And I do look forward to seeing all of you again in 2 weeks. Thank you and have a great weekend.
Yeah.